every piece of wood, every type of wood has its own personality, its own depth, its own range, its own sound, its own feel, and a lot of that is based on the hardness and the density of the wood, and obviously the size, the shape, the thickness. That all makes a difference. But my favorite drum to build is as a natural wood drum set, a natural wood snare drum. It's always exciting to do custom graphics and to have different artwork on a drum. That's a pretty powerful visual representation of somebody's artwork. But when you can see the natural wood grains in a drum, and you can work the stain and you can work the finish so that those grains pop out, and you can see all the depth in the wood, and if you can look at a piece of wood and you can look at a snare drum and you can match the sound with, when you look at a drum, it looks like it should sound a certain way. And if you can match those two things together, that's perfection from my. If you look at a drum and it looks like it should sound very warm and it does, then you did something right. But there's this amazing symmetrical smoothness to a snare drum that I still really get excited about. Just to have a solid piece of wood that is smooth in one continuous circle, and the grain, when you have a drum that's got vertical grain to it, and you can hear the sound travel through the grain of the wood. And there's very little glue, so that the glue doesn't have any tonal qualities to it. So you just get the natural tonal qualities of the wood and the natural sound waves traveling through that wood. It's a pretty amazing sound. And a lot of times different wood have different types of grain, and so if you can take a piece of wood that has very clean and straight and vertical grain to it, you don't want to disrupt that with a lot of hardware that takes away from that visual flow. So it's pretty interesting if you can take very thin tube lugs, for example. They have a very vertical look to them, and it just accents the wood instead of taking away from the wood. Hardware is an important part, right? It's got a very functional purpose to it, and it has a lot of aesthetic value to it. But if you're building a drum from scratch, it's all about the way that wood looks, and that's got to be the most important thing. Next to the sound, obviously, the sound is the most important, but it's the wood that makes the drum. So I try to use hardware that's not going to distract from that, but rather accents it and allows you to see the wood through the hardware. That's an important thing to me. And I think it's easy to say, well, you want that high gloss look to a drum, because I think that has a pretty logical woodworking feel to have that gloss finish to it. But sometimes that actually takes away from the drum a little bit as well. If you have a drum that's has a very rich and dark grain to it, maybe it's a piece of reclaimed wood that you took from a piece of antique furniture or from an old barn. That piece of wood has some personality to it that's old, and it's weathered and it's textured. So you want that natural weathered, textured look to it. You want it to be protected so it lasts long, but you don't want that artificial gloss finish to it. And so that's something that you just learn over time, and if you can get lucky and the wood has little holes in it, whether they're nail holes or notches from where a shelf was, I think that adds to the personality of the drum, and just leave that, those little blemishes in the wood, and try to work around that. It's a pretty cool opportunity.